welcome back to another episode of the Tech Talks Daily podcast. I'm your host, Neil C. Hughes, and today we're going to be diving into the world of cybersecurity and emerging technologies. With us today, we've got a return guest, Nathan Howe, VP of Emerging Technology and 5G at Zscaler. And in a world that is becoming increasingly hybrid, where global economic instability is rife and cyber threats are evolving rapidly, Nathan is going to be sharing his insights on the importance of zero trust architecture. And this is not just about enhancing security, it's about transforming businesses. Because with improved resilience, faster performance, lower costs, zero trust architecture is emerging as a powerful business solution. And I think it's a topic that should be high on the C-suite agenda, and one that businesses just cannot afford to ignore. And we'll also be unravelling the concept of zero trust architecture if it's new to you, a principle that does uphold the least privilege in computing to safeguard businesses' assets, where only authorized entities gain access to the right applications and data sets. If we have time, we'll also look at a few misconceptions and myths around zero trust too. So buckle up and hold on tight as I beam your ears all the way to Sweden today, where Nathan is going to take a deep dive into this intriguing topic. So a massive warm welcome back to the show, Nate. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do, just for anyone that's missed our previous conversation?
Well, hopefully everyone's attached and listening to your show, Neil, so it shouldn't be anything new for them, but Nathan Howe is my name. I'm the Vice President of Emerging Technologies at Zscaler, so that means I get to build and play with all the net new cool things that are coming down the future pipeline. So one thing we've been working on the last couple of years is 5G and edge compute. That may pop up in this conversation as well. So yeah, I'm very privileged to be here and chat with you again.
Well, there's so much I wanted to invite you back on here to talk about today. So just to set the scene for today's conversation, can you offer a bit of an overview of zero trust architecture and why it's becoming increasingly important for businesses, especially in today's hybrid workforce and evolving cybersecurity landscape, global conflict? There's so much going on out there, and I know it's an incredibly complex topic that a lot of businesses might find daunting and overwhelming. So can you set the scene and tell me a little bit more about it?
Absolutely. I think you actually nailed it. So many organizations kind of get stuck as deers in the, not that they're doing anything wrong, but deer in the headlights kind of scenario. There's just so much to achieve. And the zero trust, for lack of a better phrasing, a buzzword gets, some to be part of their vernacular, and it's something else they have to worry about. So look, in its simplest terms, zero trust is the final proper implementation of a good old fashioned computing idea of least privilege. If you think about many years ago, mainframe services, you could only run a service that you're allowed to for a certain time. When your cards were finished processing through the unit, that was it, you were done. You could no longer have access to the system. You'd be asked to leave the building or whatever else. And ultimately, that idea has persisted throughout computing. You think about how we have things like kernel spaces and user spaces, et cetera, et cetera. The idea is so that you are only able to do and run the thing that you're allowed to and nothing more. This became even harder as we've gone to the world of interconnected devices, networks, and so forth. So it's become very, very challenging to manage this. And what zero trust is today is the actual implementation of, well, I have a business. I want to protect it. I want to ensure that my users can only get to what they need to and nothing more. But also do this in a way that is not anchored in any one technology or any one location or network. Drive the ubiquitous nature of connectivity, but at the same time provide that least privilege. And ultimately, that's what zero trust really comes down to, is saying, well, I want from my business to protect my assets and not expose them to anybody who's not allowed. And so I have to go through this process of ensuring I create these granular roles. Now, the big misconception is that zero trust is thrown at everything nowadays. Everyone talks about zero trust. But the crux of it is really that. It's the least privilege and nothing more. And of course, there's a process of, and you'll hear from many of the vendors out there, never trust, always verify, and so forth. But really, it comes down to the fact of we want to ensure that only the right entity gets access to the right application or the right data set with the correct approval and nothing more. So that, again, least privilege is the simplest way to summarize it.
And I think for years I've been asking leaders on this podcast, especially in the security space, if the C-suite actually gets the value of cybersecurity now. And over the years, the good news is the answer is largely yes. But obviously we're now asking a lot more of them. So I've got to ask, why should their zero trust architecture be a priority for the C-suite? And how can it help businesses stay ahead of potential security threats for anyone from a C-suite listening? Because this is like the next level now, isn't it?
Yeah, and then look, this is obviously where it's not just a matter of talking to the C-suite, but enabling the listeners that are engaging with their C-suite to kind of help package the message correctly. And then the one thing that is very, very critical about this is finding the value you can bring to a business. And I was in a workshop earlier this week where one of the presenters said, we need to think about value not in terms of dollar figures, because that's very soft in a lot of terms, but the value when you think of is units of value. And I kind of like made a joke of maybe we need to put that on a blockchain somewhere. But the idea of showing each business has its own considered version of value. So what are you doing to the business? So how do you bring this technology, this zero trust functionality, and bring benefit? A good example would be moving away from legacy infrastructure so you can decommission things. So you can show that we no longer need to have data center A or B. That's one. But that's not necessarily just a zero trust thing. Zero trust is enabling that. Again, by enabling that only allow the individual or initiator the right initiator to the right application. But the big thing to talk about when talking to the C-suite around zero trust is the actual business cases that it can drive beyond just removing things. So how does the business shift its way of thinking? And one good example that I can share is it's not just tying zero trust to everything. It's thinking about how zero trust can be specific to your individual business use cases. And this business that I'm referring to here actually were moved away from deploying physical infrastructure, firewalls, routers, cables, SD-WANs, all those things, and just went to the good old-fashioned, well, not old-fashioned, but everyone's got a 5G SIM card in their pocket, and that is also theoretically a 5G and 4G and Wi-Fi and Bluetooth kind of SD-WAN box in itself. Now, the historical idea was, well, that if we have to protect that. We have to put them on a network and protect them. Well, with zero trust, is saying that protection is an overlay over any of those networks. It doesn't matter which network you switch to. And what that company realized was that, hold on a second, if that's the case, then and ultimately it is, they no longer have to provision infrastructure. They can just give out SIM cards or mobile or 5G enabled devices, and ensure that the protection goes across it. So the true value is not necessarily going to be a blanket, it's better or it's worse. It's figuring out what is the value that you can operate within your business and show your business that they can change their model of operation. That's where the C-suite gets interested. But the big thing is also reducing those cyber risks. And that's the biggest thing today. I think most of us, including all the C-suites, talk about is, how do I reduce my exposure? And as I mentioned before, the crux of zero trust is never allowing anyone to connect anything without being authorized. Think of it like this today. A typical network is you connect and then you authenticate. So you go on the network, you can access the network, you can see the applications, you connect to the applications, and then you authenticate. Zero trust is saying, hold on, you can't do anything until you authenticate. So you authenticate, then you connect. And that shifts the risk model dramatically and allows businesses to operate in a much more effective way without the impact of, well, not saying all cyber risks go away, but certainly mitigates a larger number of those cyber risks. So long story short, you need to figure out the value that is specific to the business, of course, but also one of the biggest things is going to drive that reduction in cyber risk that we're also commonly hearing about every day.
And for many people outside the industry, when they hear things like zero trust, they probably automatically think, hey, it's only relevant for larger organizations, or it's too complicated to implement. It's just about security. It's about trusting nobody ever. You probably hear these phrases all the time. So I've got to ask, what are some of the common misconceptions about zero trust architecture that maybe we can address today and finally lay some of those myths to rest? And also, how can businesses begin to implement it more effectively once they know some of the truths behind it?
Yeah, and this is the biggest thing. I think one of the arguments I'll ask, or I love to challenge anyone to talk to you about zero trust is before they even get started with zero trust, do they actually know what assets they have inside their organization? Do they have an accurate inventory of their applications or accurate inventory of their data and the data classifications, etc.? And maybe I'd say 7 out of 10 would say no. Those last 3 would actually have a pretty aggressive path towards it, and they're obviously well-informed and ready to start a very granular zero trust project. But anyone can start zero trust, and that's the challenge. Is not just to say I don't know. And if you don't have that granular definition of every individual, every server, and every process, well, you have to start somewhere to figure that out. You just can't say I don't know. And the advantage of zero trust is that it's an evolution. It's not a product first and foremost. It's not a destination. It's going to be a continuous journey. And the best part about that is that you can actually leverage what you learn from each stage to iterate and get better. So one of the things I encourage, customers to actually work on is start with simple divisions. So users. Let's just address the users. We'll deal with workloads later on. We'll deal with IoT or OT, other things later on as well. But let's focus just on users. Stick those users in a bucket, and then let's make sure they can't access what they're not allowed to. And right away, you've taken your first step towards your zero trust path. Funnily enough, most of us did that in 2020 when we decided to put all of our users, not in the office, and let them all work from home. We actually took that step. So we need to learn from that opportunity and then iterate. And honestly, that's where it comes to, is that iterative idea of looking at what we've got. And again, zero trust is an idea of delivering that insight as well. So not just authorizing the right user or right initiator to get to a destination, but also logging it. So then using that information to then iterate further and further. So you can say that a simple example is that the security team needs access to the firewalls, but they don't need access to the HR system. These sort of logic of connectivity actually comes more from the business. And so why I say it's an easy path to start with, anyone can start anywhere. Every company has a basic idea of roles and responsibilities. Leverage those as your beginning point. Start with the users, work on the roles and responsibilities. Again, HR shouldn't have access to the switching environment. The security team shouldn't have access to the finance system and so forth. Those are roles and responsibilities that arguably sit with the business, and you can leverage that to begin to build your zero trust path, however you decide to implement it.
And I think because of the economic climate and uncertainty at the moment, I think every tech project is now especially under close scrutiny around the ROI and the value that IT project could deliver. So for that side of things, for decision makers listening, can you expand on some of the tangible business benefits of adopting zero trust architecture? Because there is a lot, isn't there, from improved security, resilience, performance, and lower costs. And maybe you've got an example or two that you could share with everyone to just bring that to life a little.
Yeah, and I think that the key here is that everyone's going to be different. There's always going to be some sort of way in which we can provide a value. But the key here is that by ensuring that the crux of zero trust, an authorized entity going to a destination that's only allowed, means you can rethink the way in which that has historically been provided. So we've all put this on the magic network, the magic internal network, connected everything. So again, using the example of everyone going and working from home, well, if you continuously provide that functionality even in the office, so you go away from having a dedicated user LAN or WAN and just have a 5G environment or a Wi-Fi environment like a Starbucks, then right away you've rethought you can redeliver an entire new way of working for your enterprise, which reduces the friction, the experience. It makes it much better for the employees to work. There's less hardware to worry about. There's less overhead in troubleshooting. So all of these things can be very simple benefits to a business that it becomes tangible when you multiply it by number of sites and locations and users. But the biggest thing I think for customers and listeners to think about here is, what are the areas we can start making those quick wins in that then turn around to be a very good example of the business. Then once we show in the business, we can expand that use case. And one really simple use case that it's one that becomes more and more apparent in the world as we get this convergence of IT into the operational technology space, is that OT organizations have a very stringent set of rules and controls. And so what we normally do is stick some sort of policy control around how to ensure the OT environment works. And that's actually a thing called the Purdue model. And what that basically entails is you can't jump from VLAN to VLAN. You have to go through quite stringent segmentation. That's all well and good, but they normally then front this with a VPN, so some inbound VPN solution, which means that each OT site normally has to have its own inbound internet connection, and you've got to protect the inbound services against DDoS, and you have to have all the authentication and so forth. With a zero trust service, we're saying don't allow anyone to connect unless they're authorized. What that means is that there's no inbound connections into those ecosystems. So the example I like to give is where we've worked with operational technology environments in some of our larger customers to completely remove their inbound VPN services and just simply use a zero trust platform from Zscaler, the Zscaler private access, to ensure that the access is available in a granular mechanism, but without putting that OT site at risk, and actually even more so, without having that OT site being discovered on the open internet for someone to play with. And that gives a number of cost benefits and so forth. But the most important one is there's a bit of peace of mind for the companies operating these OT sites, because they no longer have that risk of the site being exposed. Now, it does move the risk down the stack a little bit, but it removes that major risk that is being exposed and possibly having an unpatched VPN or whatever it may be. So it's a good example of where identifying a quick win can be very beneficial. And this use case we've rolled out with customers is not for thousands and thousands and thousands of users. It's for a subset of users for third-party access at a few hundred sites. So it's a very simple set of services that can be controlled and show value. And coming back to the tangible outputs of the business, shows them how to deliver a quick win that then knock-on effect is, hey, we can do more of this and provide more functionality, and we can rethink the ways in which we've provided connectivity for now our B2B, our workloads, our users, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So start somewhere and then evolve from that.
And of course, anyone that runs a quick search online for zero trust or zero trust architecture, they will quickly discover that it is an incredibly crowded marketplace out there. So my question has got to be, how do you at Zscaler, your approach, how does Zscaler's approach to zero trust architecture differ from other solutions in the market? And what are the unique value offering does it bring to businesses?
Yeah, so I appreciate that the market is quite complicated, and that's actually two things here. Why is we created and launched a non-branded book kind of to explain what the kind of underlying requirements and fundamentals of zero trust are. So we released that last year, the 7 elements for a successful zero trust architecture, and the goal is to help paint a standard across the industry to align on all of the various terminology and so forth. And I think that's one thing is when we look at what Zscaler is able to offer, and by the way, Zscaler, I'm Australian, I should say Zscaler, but I'm working for an American company, so it's Zscaler, and then all the fun that happens from that. But the goal that I think that we have is not necessarily to say that we are better than others, but just to show what we do. And I think the strengths that we have, and I'll outline a couple of them that are very important, is that unlike, we like to look at things agnostically. So we operate wherever we possibly can. So we're not locked into any one sort of location for operation. We are a cloud-first service, so that rather than offering the services on premises as a first option, we provide the controls in our cloud globally. But we've also realized that as we are software, our customers may want to run us locally as well. So we can run locally as well. So we are, in that regards, to, for lack of a better phrasing, a hybrid. We can provide hybrid functionalities for our customers. But the biggest thing, and probably the most important thing for me, is that we've been doing this for 15 years, and we realized early on that it comes down to individual controls in individual connections. So what I mean by that, and this is where I can get slightly technical for a second, is that we don't allow connections to happen just blindly across a network. What we're saying is that when you're the end user or there's a workload communicating, each individual session has to have its own unique path. And not just a unique path from the initiator. So from, like, example, my laptop connecting to YouTube is one session. Now that one session could go one path, and we can send that on its own way. But if I then create a new session, maybe to my internal ERP system, that shouldn't follow the same path. In fact, we need to figure out what is the most optimal path, and we can send that down a different direction, rather than being reliant on sending everything from the client, the laptop, up to the cloud edge, and then splitting it off of the cloud edge to different network paths. What we're saying here is actually each time I create a new session, before I send it, I'm going to make sure I have the right path from the client side, and then the client will then send it to various merry way. So think of it kind of like in the old world, we would have said there was like route-based policy or policy-based routing, but it's not routing because we're not actually reliant on the network. We overlay the controls of the network. And so it's more policy-based steering, if you will. And that becomes extremely powerful when you start looking at the multitude of applications that exist in different locations, plus the user is moving from network to network or may have access to various services in different networks. To simplify, we don't do hairpinning or whatever else. We want to connect the user in the most effective way, or the initiator in the most effective way to its destination. And that for me is the most technically cool thing we do, so that when we start taking this and extrapolating it out into things like 5G and edge, which we've spoken about it before, is the idea of that we can run workloads very close to the user at low latency. That's great, but if my control layer, my security layer is in the cloud, that low latency doesn't work anymore because I have to leave out to go to the cloud to get the control and come back to the workload. I need to be able to provide that control locally. And what Zscaler can do, because of that multi-path selection that we have, we can just provide a direct path to what we need to provide. And that, aligning with all of the technology we've built over these 15 years around the various controls in line, give us a very unique position in the industry. And then to add one last piece to it is we don't see it as just being in line. We also see it about being, so inline is data in motion, of course. And then we have data at rest at the destination. We need to then query and look at those information sets and make sure they're matching the controls that we want to apply. But also we have data in initiation, if you will, understanding where that information is being utilized on a client. So those things, that kind of end-to-end flow, as well as information and data being stored, and having that unified policy to control that, is kind of where we sit in an advantageous point of view. So yeah, again, it's a lot. I could go on and on about this, and we'd probably do a different podcast solely around that. But yeah, that for me is that technological complexity that we have. We simplify it for the end user. So it's a really simple experience, but it's driven and built to make sure that it is optimized and driving the most efficient experience for the initiator or the user. And all the complexity is taken away by us. So that's the idea, is all that complexity, really cool, fun routing, steering stuff, but we make it simple and people connect and get the most effective experience.
And with your extensive experience in technology combined with this go-to market strategy, it feels like you're right in the eye of the storm here. So I'm curious, are there any key trends that you've observed in cloud security in recent months? And also, how do you envision zero trust architecture continue to evolve in the coming years? Is there anything that's caught your eye at the moment?
Absolutely. I think the three main areas of focus that we're going to see in the next few years have just started kind of permeating out of cloud. So the idea of delivering orchestrated services in a cloud environment, those orchestrated services will now move into things like edge compute. So running a workload very close to low latency, maybe augmented reality or whatever that needs to happen, that is being driven by the 5G revolution, but also by the fact that 5G is trying to, from a back-end infrastructure, is cloning that kind of cloud workload definition, not heavy lift VMs, but a bunch of microservices that are executed all in parallel. So I think that for me is kind of three things. One is, as cloud becomes more and more prevalent, it will become more and more local with edge compute, but it'll also become more, let's say, minimized into smaller services in that microservice direction. Those things all drive a new way of thinking towards zero trust, because now you're going to have this, for lack of a better word, a mesh of services that need to speak to each other and follow things around and move data here and there, depending on where the initiator is and the destination is. And that is where I think zero trust already plays a very good point into it, because we can actually start making those decisions very early on. We know that if it's authorized, it can get access, and this is the path we define. So I think that is going to drive a huge direction in the industry, if it isn't already. And I think that most enterprises need to be aware of the fact that cloud is going to evolve into that local compute, edge compute environment, if it hasn't already for them, especially in those industries of manufacturing and warehouses. But we're also going to see a lot more of, and I have to say it because everyone talks about it, but the efficiencies brought by AI. Now, I'm not talking ChatGPT or generative AI, although they may have a play here. In terms of security, AI is actually really simple because we have a fairly defined set of data sets. Same with connectivity as well. You're not dealing with the intricacies of language, of a human language. You're dealing with, this is a packet header, this is the This is the IP address. This is the actual payload. They're fairly simple in terms of what we need to have an AI system process. So we can actually see, and we will see, the evolution of what I mentioned before, that intelligent path selection becoming even more informed, that'll help us steer around, for example, backbone failures, fiber cuts, those sort of things. We'll see that becoming more and more of a dynamic process in the future. So that's where, as organizations, I think we need to think about not how I route a network, because the network will become ultimately just this big mesh of paths, which it already kind of is, but will be more and more effective in the future. And think about how we're going to provide the connectivity of from that initiated to the destination, and a secure path, a secure mechanism that Zero Trust already does today, but will only be optimized more with the intelligence of AI, the intelligence of the learning that will come from these billions of transactions a day.
And I'm glad you did mention Gen AI there. I know it's a saturated topic at the moment, but there is that argument of things like malware emails quickly become incredibly easy to personalize and send and improve the language and the structure of those emails. So we'll see things happening there. And also, as cyber threats continue to evolve, how can businesses future-proof their security strategy with Zero Trust architecture? And what kind of role do you see Zscaler playing in supporting these efforts? Because it's quite challenging, isn't it, keeping up with the pace of this change at the moment?
Absolutely. And I think this is the hot topic of the time. And I honestly, this is leveraging that generative AI, let's say, for lack of better phrasing, fear. Yeah. There is an opportunity for enterprises to think about things that are often overlooked. And this is the challenge I like to give to customers and discuss in workshops is, what are your key assets? And one of the things that we saw a few weeks ago, Samsung, as an example, blocked the use of ChatGPT because they were afraid of their source code being uploaded into the platform. And that's fair. That's a legitimate concern. But companies are taking this blanket approach to blocking things. And I get that because it's a natural reaction. But I would actually turn it around and say, don't block the services, because if you block a service, it's going to be a game of whack-a-mole. There'll be another service tomorrow. Somebody can build the next one and so forth. Actually, what we need to do, and where I think enterprises can really start getting into this step forward and start future-proofing their environment, that will only be leveraged, more importantly, by Zero Trust, is to know what their key assets are. And a key asset, or your crown jewels, it really comes down to understanding what that is, and it will be different for every company. It could be schematics of a chipset, it could be your financial information, et cetera, but knowing what that is critical. So having a proper inventory of critical assets, maybe not all assets, but your critical assets, and the content there will be the future-proofing function for the future. Because what happens then is, that, then you can use a Zero Trust service to say, well, I don't want my chip schematics to go out to the internet. I don't want my source code to be uploaded to ChatGPT. But someone can still use ChatGPT and play with, ask it to write you an email to your boss, or whatever. So we need to be able to do that. Otherwise, the mindset of blocking things, blocking applications, will only cause more shadow IT. And we should be protecting our assets more than we are about blocking the destinations, which I know can be challenging. But the one piece of advice I give to everybody listening right now is, if you were to go through a tabletop exercise, and I hope it's only tabletop and none of you ever have to go through this, but if you do get ransomware and you do have an outage that brings you down to zero, if nothing running, what are the first applications that you turn on? What are the first things you rebuild? Those are your core assets. Those are the things you need to protect and understand the content of those. And that's what you need to protect against in terms of the solution and moving forward. And then Zero Trust will only help you make sure that those things are protected. But again, you need to have that exercise. And again, I hope nobody goes through that, but goes through a tabletop exercise to figure that out, because then you'll be informed to move forward in the future.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you back on the podcast. We have been talking now about a very serious topic. And as this is your hat trick of appearances, to celebrate, it's time to have a little bit of fun with you. And I'm going to ask you, what is the funniest or most interesting story that has happened in your career when you look back at everything that you've experienced?
Well, there's a lot, but I will say one that I think always comes up to mind, and it's probably not just funny, well, it's embarrassing as well. But in one of my previous companies, during the days of Stuxnet, as it was running around the internet, I managed to identify it running inside of our company's ecosystem, and had set up a phone call with all of our executives and people to kind of like explain what this meant, that Stuxnet had made its way inside of our ecosystem. And at one point, one of the managers decided to tell me he didn't believe what I was saying because it couldn't possibly happen. Stuxnet was not meant to target us; it was meant to target uranium enrichment facilities. And in my response, I was sitting listening to him, and I didn't put myself on mute. And I may have used some pretty expletive words to insult him, only to have my colleagues pop up like gophers from their various cubicles because they were still on the call. And one came running over and put me on mute. So luckily, hey, I still ended up working for the company for a long time, and I didn't get fired. But it's one of those things that I'm actively, almost nowadays, kind of like paranoid about. I'm always checking to make sure my audio status, whichever call I'm on, because I don't want to misspeak or say something. So lesson learned, and apologies to that manager if he's listening. I didn't mean to call you those things. And as an Australian, we don't tend to have a broad vocabulary to use as insults. But it was not intended to be rude. It was just because I was frustrated at the lack of movement. But hey, in the end, it worked out well.
What a brilliant story. And I think there'll be a lot of people nodding their head there, because I think we've all been there at some point. And for anyone listening, just wanting to find out more information about anything we talked about today, we did cover a lot in a short amount of time. Where would you like to point everyone listening to find out more about Zscaler and the kind of work that you're doing on this?
Yeah, actually, it's good timing to ask that question. So, and for those of you who would like to know more specifically for our customers, we actually have a big annual user meetup happening in June. It's called Zenith Live or Zenith Live, depending on which part of the world you're in. And it's actually an opportunity for you to come along and talk and engage with our customers and see what's going on from their side, but also just to see what's happening from Zscaler towards our products in the future as well. So visit the website www.zenithlive.com or so zenithlive.com. That's zenithlive.com. And you can register for one of the two global locations. One is in Las Vegas and one is in Berlin. Hopefully those of you in Europe can attend the one in Berlin. I'll be there and look forward to meeting with many of you in person, and then talking about some more silly stories where I say some bad things to bosses in my past. So thank you. And I hope hopefully everyone can join us. It'd be a really good event.
Well, what I've loved about our conversation today is talking about zero trust architecture, but not just from a security perspective, and as almost an ultimate transformative business solution that can deliver tangible business benefits, such as better resilience, faster performance, lower cost. This is the language that will appeal to the C-suite. A big thank you for bringing it all to life today and joining us for your hat trick of appearances on Tech Talks Daily.
Thank you, Neil. It's been a pleasure. I look forward to the next one, and hopefully we can talk about other things that are interesting and fun, like locations for conferences and such.
That's it for today's episode of the Tech Talks Daily podcast. A big thank you to Nathan for sharing his invaluable insights into the world of zero trust architecture. I think today we discovered how this security approach not only fortifies our defences, but can also transform businesses by boosting resilience, enhancing performance, and reducing costs. And for that, I think we highlighted why zero trust architecture needs to be a higher priority for businesses in this ever-evolving digital landscape. So to learn more about Zscaler and their innovative approach towards cybersecurity, head over to their website, and please stay tuned to this podcast for more insightful discussions with leaders and pioneers in the industry. And remember, you can email me, techblogwriter@outlook.com, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, just @NeilCHughes. But a big thank you for listening as always. And until next time, don't be a stranger.